So I got my start in voter protection in 2020. And I wrote a Facebook post at the beginning of the year, looking ahead, thinking about the November elections. And it was something of a promise to myself. I said, there's two questions I'm going to ask myself this year. If not now, then when? And if not me, then who? And that really became my mantra for the year.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Wilson.
And I'm Mary New, and we're the co-founders of Hoosier Victory Alliance.
You're listening to What the Gerrymander, our podcast about reclaiming and rebuilding our collective political power in MAGA-captured states. Last week, Heidi Beidinger had COVID, and today she's on vacation in the tropics, but she will be back next week. Our podcast is for Hoosiers and people living in other MAGA-captured states, because MAGA is implementing the same strategy of voter suppression, gerrymandering, and cruel culture war legislation across the country. And if you live in a blue state, please consider adopting Indiana or another MAGA-captured state to help contest every seat and roll back the autocracy happening in front of our eyes. A $20 recurring donation to HVA will help us to start Blue Indiana and fund every single legislative candidate. Today, we're talking to Kim Allen. During the 2020 election cycle, Kim was Deputy Director of Voter Protection at the Democratic Party of Georgia, where she led the ballot monitoring program. She now lives in Dallas, Texas, where she co-founded and runs Power the Vote and has founded Blue Texas as a part of Every State Blue. In this conversation, Kim shares details about voter protection in Georgia and in Texas and envisions voter protection programs in Indiana and in other MAGA-captured states that currently lack a year-round voter protection effort. Her precise and action-oriented discussion inspired us to envision a voter protection plan in Indiana. If she inspires you too, in Indiana or your own state, she has graciously agreed to talk to anyone interested in starting a program in MAGA-captured states.
Welcome, Kim. We are so excited about having this conversation today. I cannot tell you. Many people might not know Kim Allen directly, but they sure know the work that you've been up to in Georgia to protect the vote. When we talk to our audience today, what I hope that they will hear that when we talk about voter protection, when we talk about protecting everybody's right to vote, it is a year-round work. It is something that the parties cannot do on their own. They need cooperation. They need effort from our activists on the ground. So I'm truly hoping that everybody hears that today. It plays right into one of my favorite quotes. I'm from Massachusetts, and I always quote JFK. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. I want to leave that little seed in everybody's head because that's what voter protection is all about. It's everybody jumping in and giving a helping hand.
All right. So Kim, you're down there in Dallas, but can you tell us how you got involved in voter protection and where you were and how you started and how that path has taken you?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, folks. It's great to be here today. So I got my start in voter protection in 2020. At that time, I was working at a law firm, practicing law, and I wrote a Facebook post at the beginning of the year, looking ahead, thinking about the November elections, and it was something of a promise to myself. I said, there's two questions I'm going to ask myself this year. If not now, then when? And if not me, then who? And that really became my mantra for the year. And, as I wrestled with what I would do, because I do think we all have an obligation to do something, whatever we can do to support democracy and to fight for a better America. And so as I was wrestling with what my part of that would be, I decided I would take a leave of absence from my law firm job. I had just finished paying off my law school loans. And I felt like there was an opportunity for me to step away from my law practice and do something more than I had done in prior years. So I took a leave of absence. I thought, well, look, I'll just take off 6 months and I'll go be an overqualified volunteer working on the ground in Georgia. I picked Georgia because there were 2 Senate seats up and because one of my very good law friends was the voter protection director at the Democratic Party of Georgia. So I called her up. I said, hey, could you use a volunteer? She said, yes, absolutely. So I said, all right. At the time I thought I'd moved down, had no idea, the pandemic hadn't yet blown up. And so I had no idea how everything would change, how difficult elections would become in the midst of the pandemic. and also that Georgia would become kind of the center of the political universe in the months that followed. But it ended up being the right place at the right moment in time. And that's how I got my start. I saw, we worked with volunteers, thousands of volunteers in Georgia to help elections just simply work and to help voters get their votes counted and cast their ballots. And that work really inspired me, and that set me off on this path. Now this is my full-time job. I've stepped away from the practice of law entirely, and this is the work I do year-round.
Wow. So that election in 2020, we're still hearing about. Yesterday, Marjorie Taylor Greene screaming about how Georgia was completely mismanaged in the way it counted its vote. I'm sure you have something to say about what actually happened on the ground there. Can you tell me a little bit about that mismatch between what you saw and protected and made happen and the narrative that the MAGA Republicans tell us about voter fraud and elections?
Yeah, well, so I actually have a good amount of experience with how elections work in Georgia. The program that I organized sent volunteers to elections offices to observe as they opened, scanned, and processed absentee ballots. And more than 1 million Georgia voters cast absentee ballots in 2020. So it's a lot of ballots. And so my volunteers were there on the ground. We had volunteers in all 159 Georgia counties. And they were there as the elections were run, and they saw how they processed the ballots. They ensured that Georgia law was followed, that they implemented best practices, flagged any issues that came up. And then they also were there and sat on panels that adjudicate ballots when there's some question as to how the voter intended to vote. So the folks that I organized had a front row seat to how elections were being conducted in Georgia. And there were all kinds of false allegations that swirled. I kind of actually came into it with a premonition that this was going to become the real hot potato in Georgia, especially if it went blue, which, Joe Biden won. And so when the elections got called for Joe Biden, suddenly a bunch of Republicans descended on these elections offices to try to disrupt the process, to intimidate elections workers, to intimidate my volunteers. They'd follow them out in their cars and snap photos of their license plates and things like that. And, these folks were really on the front line. So they saw everything that unfolded in Georgia. Some of the allegations included, like in Fulton County, allegations that elections workers were bringing in bags of fake ballots and scanning them. And my folks were there to say that never happened. There was also a lot of video footage as well. And so there's so many of these false allegations. Of course, it wrecks these election workers' lives. It really impacted them, but it also impacted confidence in the election results. So it's one of the really unfortunate things that came away from 2020 is that, people believe some of these lies about what happened. But I wasn't there in every elections office in Georgia, but, the folks that I organized saw firsthand that elections in Georgia were done according to law, that the right processes were followed, and, overwhelmingly, that should give people confidence in those results.
What really struck me about that, just want to reiterate what you really honed in on, was volunteers. Volunteers made our elections safer. People stepped up. I just want to applaud all your efforts. And people sometimes forget that elections run on 25% maybe of paid staff and the rest of the 75% of volunteers. So well done on that volunteer segment that protected our elections.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, our elections don't work. Our democracy doesn't work without people participating. That includes people stepping up to be poll workers and poll watchers. But, something that's also surprising to people is that nationwide, 60% of election administration positions are either partisan elected or partisan appointed. And that includes volunteer roles. So, for example, in Georgia, the vote review panels that we organize volunteers to attend and sit on, those panels decide whether and how absentee ballots get counted. If a voter, marks two selections or they cross something out and write something else, someone has to look at that and decide how to count that vote. And it's volunteers who do it. And there are other roles as well. Some are paid, some are unpaid, but there's all kinds of roles at the state and local level where people can sign up and get involved and actually make democracy work. So, what part of my message to folks is, it's really empowering. I have so many people who come to me and they're worried about democracy and they think, look, elections are falling apart. there's a lot that's concerning and we should take it very seriously, take the threat incredibly seriously. But there's also a lot that we as individuals can do to make elections work and make our democracy work for all of us.
Wow, that's a great segue. First of all, to hear that those kind of numbers, that is a huge deal that our country, our democracy doesn't work without the people making the government. So you were in Georgia, you went through the election, and then somehow you made it to Texas. And I'd love to hear about your journey between working on the 2020 election in Georgia and then moving along to Texas and how you got involved in voter protection. One of the things that I have heard said about Texas is that it's not as much a red state as a voter suppressed state. So if you can maybe tell us a little bit about what you do, but then also how voter suppression plays into what you're working on.
Absolutely. So by way of background, I'm a Texas native. I was born in Plano, which is sort of a Dallas suburb, and went to college here in Texas, and then moved to DC for law school and practiced law. In the pandemic, I decided, look, what am I doing up here? I had to get back home, get to where the fight is back in Texas. So I moved back home. And, in the midst of all of the work that we were doing in Georgia, it was the first time in my life that I felt like I was the right person at the right place at the right moment in time. So I knew this work was really impactful. I saw the power of organizing thousands of people to defend democracy and defend voters and fight for their rights. And I said, this work is so powerful. We ought to be doing a lot more of it. And at the same time, I saw that so much of our investment in voter protection is really driven by campaign cycles. Some of these programs start when the campaigns pick up and then they end when the campaigns leave. And, it occurred to me, especially with all the events that transpired after the elections, January 6th was the day after the Senate runoff election. And, as we woke up, we were elated, at the results that we saw in Georgia and the prospect of a blue Senate. But that was the very same day that our democracy came under literal attack as insurrectionists descended on the Capitol. So I said, our work is clearly not finished. The fight for democracy is obviously not finished. So I thought, well, look, what can we do? We had this incredible experience in Georgia. Our work made the margin of victory. We cured 15,000 ballots, which on its own accounted for President Biden's margin of victory in November of 2020. We took 130,000 calls on our hotline in 7 languages. And we organized over 3,000 poll watchers to observe at polling places and make sure that elections ran smoothly on the ground on election day. And so coming into that experience and seeing the power of it and how it can help win election, I thought, well, look, there's so much more to do. So we said, what's the problem that we can solve? Part of what we took away from our experience in Georgia is that voter protection can't just be something you do during the campaigns. Georgia was one of the very first states to have a year-round voter protection program starting in 2018. So when the campaigns leave, Georgia continued to fight for democracy and fight for voters, even in what we call the off cycle. And so, there's really no off years in democracy. We have elections, year round, especially local elections. And there's also tons of election administration work that happens in those off years, including budgeting for these elections offices, setting training programs for poll workers, deciding where you're going to put polling places and their hours. There's just all kinds of decisions that get made. And so shouldn't we be using what we can use and advocating for expanded access for voters and doing other work that you could do year round to fight for democracy, fighting voter purges, you name it. There's just so much work to do. So we said, well, let's fund that. Let's talk to people about our experience in Georgia, how voter protection was so critical to the election wins, and show them how that work tied back to the year-round work. Show them how it wouldn't have been possible for us to do the work we did if we had been starting over from scratch every 2 years and standing up a program just a few months before the election instead of laying the groundwork in the year before. So we decided to found Power the Vote to do just that. The mission of Power the Vote is to fund permanent year-round voter protection staff. And we're funding in 5 states this year: Arizona, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, and Texas. So that's how we got our start. And, it was rooted in the work we did in Georgia in 2020. but it's also grown to include these other states as well. The goal is to take those lessons learned from Georgia and bring them to other battleground states.
So Indiana obviously isn't on your list. It's really not on many people's list because it feels like such a far off day that it could really be in play. But that's why we're doing what we're doing, so that we can get started moving toward taking back Indiana from its MAGA supermajority. If you were to envision what a voter protection program in a state that has essentially nothing, what would it look like? We worked with Heidi Beidinger on her campaign for state house in the fall, and it was sort of a last minute, who can we send to the polls to make sure everything's going okay? If you were to imagine a program somewhere where there wasn't anything, what would that look like?
So, our work is focused on leveraging the Democratic Party apparatus to work for voters. So I'll speak to what I would build on the partisan side. I would create a voter protection program at the state party, and I'd have 1 to 2 voter protection staff, ideally more, but, budget constraints being what they are, about 1 to 2 staff. And the work that they would do would be focused on year-round infrastructure and relationship building. So the heart and soul of the program in Georgia in the off cycle was building relationships with county Democrats, with election officials, and with voters and volunteers. And the goal is, if you have a good relationship with the elections office, if you go to the monthly Board of Election meetings or whatever there is to do in the off cycle, you can get to know the folks who run elections locally. And when you have a problem that comes up, inevitably there's going to be some issue that comes up in elections. And when that happens, the goal is to solve the problem by picking up the phone. Often we think of litigation as first recourse when there's an election problem that comes up. But if you have those relationships, they can be your last resort instead of your first resort. So I would create a program that builds those relationships, that advocates for expanded voter access, for things like better access to polling places and more equitable distribution of polling places, advocates for things like Sunday voting opportunities, weekend voting opportunities. It varies by state and by law what you can advocate for, but there's often something you can advocate for that makes voting easier and more accessible for voters. And that's true even in really entrenched voter suppression states like Georgia, like Texas, and like Indiana. And so there's always those kinds of opportunities. That's the real core of the program, and that's most of the year-round work. But there's also, there's lots of elections that happen not just in November of a midterm year or a presidential year, but also, municipal and local elections that happen and statewide elections that happen in other years. What I would do is organize smaller programs around those elections, and that creates a knowledge base. It helps you get to know your volunteers, build their skill sets, get them knowledgeable, get them connected in and plugged into the program. And you can build volunteer capacity. And that becomes the core of your program that you can expand during a presidential year or midterm election. So that's most of what I would do. I want to just mention something that I hear often. People say they're kind of skeptical. They're like, well, look, does this really work? I mean, often in a state like Indiana, and in a state like Georgia, local election officials are Republicans. And, do they even take your calls? Do they even want to talk to you? And the answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, I organize thousands of volunteers who go to elections offices in all 159 Georgia counties. And not every county is that elections official someone who identifies with our political leaning. But overwhelmingly, they share our democratic values, our small d, pro-democracy kind of values. And as long as you're constructive and you want to work with them, they're very receptive to that kind of approach. So yes, like this kind of a program really does work. And what this does is it lays the groundwork so that when a campaign comes in, they've got something to plug into. They've got experts who know how elections work in every county, in every local place. And they can be that knowledge source and that resource. They can help develop materials that go out to voters that educate them on how to vote. And they can also educate the field staff who go knock on doors and talk to voters. So this work is really important for ultimately amplifying the campaigns that come in and laying that groundwork. And it can also mean sometimes you can solve problems that actually impact the outcome of the elections. And, not in any way that changes the results improperly, but something that ensures that actually, yes, the votes that should be counted are counted. People can cast a ballot. And in that way, really ensures that our elections reflect the will of the people who are voting. So it's a really powerful tool.
There's a lot to unpack there. And you are singing my language when you are emphasizing that when a campaign launches, they cannot do all this by themselves. There's just impossible. And the other thing I want to really emphasize that you just said is you and Georgia and other states have staff on the state party. This has to be done in tandem with the state party. So folks that are listening who will say, hey, how come the state party is doing this? It's called funding, folks. We need to be able to, when Mike makes that call and says, hey, can you donate to the state party? These are the type of tools he would implement to help protect our vote. Because we all know in the state of Indiana, there is quite a bit of voter suppression laws that keep us from being able to vote at the ballot and restrict that. So this is a workaround to help us make sure our votes are counted. So thank you for painting that picture. That's super helpful. The other thing I want to talk about is because we're not there yet, the funds aren't there. We're not at the state level. If you were to advise a campaign, we've got municipal elections coming up right now. It was very impactful when you shared a story by going in and understanding where there were some gaps. For example, one county had a lot more absentee ballots that were rejected versus the other. And then you said, oh, wait a minute. It's an educational issue. People aren't understanding how to get that ballot back, the steps that need to be done. Can you walk us through, if you're running a municipal campaign and you're running the mayor's race or the local city council races, what would you implement into your campaign strategy to make sure ballots are accepted, people know when the voting hours are, to really help us move this needle forward?
Yeah, great question. So, one thing I would do if you don't have a statewide voter protection organization at the state party level, and some states don't, if you have that organization, and of course, working very closely with them is going to be key, and they'll have the right kinds of resources to help empower your campaign. But if you don't have that, I would also coordinate with folks at the state party to plug into DNC resources. The DNC has a national voter protection hotline, which voters can call and get help in all 50 states. And I'd work to make sure that they've got the resources and the staffing for your municipal election to cover that particular day, so that if voters call and they're having an issue with the polls, there's someone who can take the call and get them and also feed that information back. It's helpful. Often these hotlines are really helpful because it creates a feedback loop so that the campaigns can say, oh, there's this issue at this polling place, and they can deploy an observer and go be outside the polling place, greet people who are coming into the polls, and keep an eye on an issue that's happening. So that's one place where I would really lean in is working with the DNC on their voter protection resources and making sure that they've got folks who can help answer calls on election day. Another thing that I would do is I mentioned the option of poll creators. So, one thing that's unique that state parties and county parties can do that the nonprofit side can't do is appoint poll watchers who are inside of polling places. I would work with my state party to identify priority precincts. These are polling locations where a lot of Democratic voters turn out, and we want to make sure that they can cast a ballot without any kind of interference. I would get some volunteers to go and be poll watchers at those polling places. And I'd pick a few key ones and then pick some of your best volunteers to get out there and make sure that we're observing. They're going to need to be credentialed, so they'll need a piece of paper that says they've been appointed so that it's all official. But they'll be able to observe inside the polling place and keep an eye on what's happening and give feedback if there's an issue that's impacting voters. So those are like the two key things that I would do. And then in the event that you have a closed election where you're behind by some small number of votes, it's going to be key to figure out who are the voters who maybe cast a provisional ballot and didn't, instead of a regular ballot, and need to take a follow-up step to cure that ballot and get it counted. That can make the difference in a closed election. And so I'd work with the state party to try to get data on which voters voted a provisional ballot or otherwise need to take some additional step to get their vote counted. It could be people who tried to vote by mail and had their ballot rejected for a technical defect, or it could be voters who show up on election day to their polling place and for some reason we're asked to vote a provisional ballot. So that's what I would do. I will mention I am not up on Indiana voting law. And so this is kind of my like generic advice, but there may be some wrinkles to that are more particular for, for Indiana voting. So I think that's a very good starting place.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's all about education. And, when we talk about Indiana and we talk about voter suppression, and there's this mindset that we're so gerrymandered, there's nothing we can do. And what's great about this conversation is there are things you can do to work around the voter suppression to make sure our votes are counted. The other thing I want to talk about on that note is after the election, we heard a lot about Gen Z. Gen Z was the big voting bloc that flipped a lot of states. Now in Michigan, our neighbors to the north, you can register to vote right up onto election day. We saw a lot of campus voting happening. In Indiana, voter registration is cut off 29 days before an election transpires. So you move, you're a student, you're in transit, you move your apartment, etc. What would you advise campaigns on how to get more Gen Zs involved in voting, but make sure they know the rules and regulations around the fact that they're in college or they've moved or now they're a grad student, new job, etc. How would you advise campaigns to really pay attention? Because in Indiana, the barriers that are there really hindered Gen Z from showing up and helping with some of our close elections.
Yeah, absolutely. So voting on campus is very, very important, but it's often a little bit of a political football. And we're seeing this in Texas now.
Yes.
They're trying to restrict. There's a bill to eliminate polling locations on college campuses, which is obviously a really concerning kind of move. So what I would do if I were a campaign wanting to connect and help turn out students on campus and make sure that they can vote, I do a few things. One is I would talk to the state party about making sure there's going to be a polling place on my local college campus. And so they can work with elections offices and try to make that happen if it's not otherwise in the plan. So I would make that my number one priority. If there is a polling place on campus, that will increase young voter turnout. Absolutely. So focus there first. The second thing I would do is use the students at the college to help do some of the organizing. So I would reach out if there's a Young Democrats group on campus, or sometimes there are groups that aren't Young Democrats, but they are Young Progressives, or they have some other kind of name that they call themselves. I would work with them to do two things. One is to get out accurate voting information to college students. I would include FAQs that they could hand out at their member meetings or post around on campus. And then if it's possible, it'd be some work, but I'd create an ambassador program and get some college students who are fired up to make an impact in their college campus elections and get out the word. One of the most important things you can do is just simply make college students aware of the fact of an election happening. And that on its own will help boost turnout on campus. So those are the things I'd really focus on, is making sure they've got an opportunity to vote on campus and make sure that they're aware of the opportunity to vote and where to vote and how to do it. And that's going to cover most of your bases.
So that is really great advice. And I'm sure we're going to be going over this, re-listening to it and making sure that people hear what you have to say. But I want to move a little bit to the other half of what you're working on right now, which is Blue Texas. Our first guest on this podcast was David Pepper, who was the founder of Blue Ohio. We are planning on implementing Blue Indiana. So I want to hear how your Blue Texas efforts are going, which every state blue raises money to fund state level candidates in every district. So can you tell me a little bit more about how things are going in Texas?
Absolutely. So Blue Texas, for those who aren't familiar with us, Blue Texas is a joint partnership of Power the Vote and Every State Blue. And we have two twin missions. One is to fund permanent year-round voter protection staff in Texas to do the work to fight for voters. And the second is to fund state House and Senate nominees, Democratic nominees. And, at heart, the purpose of Blue Texas and the reason why we founded Blue Texas is to empower voters. So the idea is we don't want to leave any voters behind. By funding Democratic state House and Senate nominees, we aim to give them someone to vote for, someone local in their community who represents them and can speak to their values. And then by funding voter protection, we help to ensure that the voters who are turned out by those state house and Senate nominees to vote are actually able to make their voices heard and cast a ballot that counts. You mentioned, Stephanie, Texas. Some people think Texas is a red state, but the fact is Texas is a non-voting state. And it's a voter suppression state, and it's a heavily gerrymandered state. And it's a lot like Indiana in that way. And some folks are very skeptical about investing in Texas and trying to flip Texas blue. And that's often the kind of impediment to this kind of work. But I think it's important to zoom back and think about the big picture here. Republicans in Texas and in a state like Indiana are using gerrymandering and voter suppression to perpetuate a myth, to make voters feel that their votes don't matter and that their voices won't be heard. And so, in gerrymandering, if you live in a place with a very heavily gerrymandered red or blue district, it makes you feel as though your vote simply doesn't matter. It's not going to make a difference in the outcome of the election. And then voter suppression also is designed to make you feel that even if you try to vote, your vote is not going to be counted. And so it puts those barriers in the way of voting. And so the idea here is let's counter that myth about that your voice doesn't matter, that your votes won't be heard. And that way really strike back at the politics of despair that are impacting our voters. That's what we're doing here in Texas, is tackling that behemoth, that dual strategy of gerrymandering and voter suppression. And we think it's a really key piece to flipping Texas blue. What it means is that we'll be turning out more Democratic voters statewide, not just in our heavily Democratic areas, but also in rural areas, because we have so many voters who live in rural communities and in gerrymandered communities who are unhappy with the state of play. As Republicans have used these strategies of gerrymandering and voter suppression, they have become more extreme because they're less accountable to voters. And what that means is more and more, they're not reflecting the will of the majority of voters in their state. And so there are lots of folks out there who align with our values, who want to see change, and they live in communities all over the state. And if we can reach them, turn them out, and then also help them get their votes counted, then we've got a winning strategy for making change in Texas and in a state like Indiana. So where we are right now, we launched Blue Texas officially on January 30th. And already in just a short period of time, just in about a month, we have 125 new members who are contributing every month to help fund our two missions, voter protection and funding state house and Senate nominees. And we're still a very young organization, and we're still working to get out the word about Blue Texas and the work that we're doing. But there's a lot of excitement about this work. I think there's a real hunger in Texas for a solution that resonates, that really gets to the core of the politics of despair here in Texas and fights back and makes change. So we're really excited by this momentum and by the energy that we're seeing. People are really plugged in and engaged. And we actually have our first Blue Texas community meeting tonight, where we're having Michelle Vallejo, who ran for Congress, is joining us. I'm really excited about it. I mean, already we're making an impact, and it's just the start of really great things to come.
Really hope that our listeners here, with the implementation of a strategy, a clear strategy, working with the state party, funding voter protection, and really educating the voters that there are ways that we can show up to vote, and not, like you said, just like we are here in Indiana, we saw a 10% decline in Democrats showing up to vote in the 2022 election because they're buying into the gerrymandered myths, and they're buying into the fact that we're so red, there's nothing we can do. But what I'm hearing from you is if we get together and do the work, we can see change within our communities. And it's just on us to show up and start doing the work.
Absolutely, we can. And this is actually something I took away from my work in Georgia. There's a really beautiful kind of activist energy in Georgia that I think probably harkens back all the way to the civil rights era and beyond. The energy is, they're not going to take my vote away. And anytime there was an issue with voting, anytime there was a voter purge, they're purging folks from the voting rolls. Anytime there's something like that came up, instead of getting upset, people got angry, but they also got active, and they went out and did something about it. And so there's this culture of empowerment that, yes, we can fight back. And it takes all of us doing it. But yes, the power is in our hands.
Get angry, but get active. That's going to be my buzzword for today. That's the phrase for today. Get angry, but get active.
I think back to the 2020 election and hearing about all those people in Georgia who would stand in line for hours and hours and hours, and just think of how really heroic they were to give that kind of time so that they could have a voice. And I think that in lots of places in the country don't have that sense that their vote and their voice is something that ought to be heard. And that's one of the things that we can be working. But one of the most important things within a state like Indiana and between states like Indiana and Texas is that we keep in communication. We start breaking down the silos. We're all on the same side. So if we can learn from you, if we can get great ideas from Ohio, if you can teach us about voter protection, if we can teach you about whatever, we need to be in contact with all the people across the country who are working on the same stuff, because it matters for each and every one of us. So I want to thank you so much for coming on our podcast and telling us about how you have saved the vote in Georgia and in Texas, and hopefully will inspire people to take some action. Maybe we have a lawyer who just doesn't know what to do with their time and wants to start up an entire Indiana voter protection plan. And if so, we will have them call you.
Yes.
But to all of our listeners, there are so many things that can and should and will be done. And we'll hear from lots of people who are doing them. So Kim is our latest. And thank you so much, Kim, for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. And thank you, Mary. I was so delighted to join you today.
Thanks for listening to our conversation with Kim Allen. Next week, we'll feature a conversation with Veronica Pedrill, the only transgender office holder in Indiana, and Greencastle, Indiana City Council member, who will talk with us about the anti-trans movement in Indiana and across the country. Please send in questions for Veronica to WTG@HoosierVictoryAlliance.org. Also, as you know, we're working toward building Blue Indiana, and ask that you make a small recurring donation at HoosierVictoryAlliance.org. If you like what you heard today, in the words of Gen Z, smash that subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, and please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. We thank you, and democracy thanks you.